You're tuned into the deep dive, and right now I know many of you are watching Nanaimo's mayor and council, maybe wondering if their decisions really reflect, taxpayer priorities.
Yeah, we've definitely heard those concerns. Rising costs, the city's direction, it's on people's minds.
Exactly. And that's what we're digging into today.
We're going straight to the source material here, looking at official city documents.
Think of it as getting you the inside track on what's really happening.
We've got the agendas from recent council meetings, the Finance and Audit Committee too, and the big ones, the proposed financial plan amendment bylaw for the next few years.
2025 to 2029, yeah.
Right. Plus the 2025 property tax rates bylaw, the latest State of the Economy report, and even the Tourism Nanaimo update.
So the goal is really to pull out the key info, see where the tax dollars are headed, and, understand the why behind these decisions.
Exactly. Context is key.
Okay, let's get right to it then. The big one for a lot of us, the financial plan and what it means for property taxes. This financial plan amendment bylaw 2025, NOM word 7389.01. It sounds like it's making some pretty significant changes.
It is. This bylaw basically takes the preliminary plan they talked about earlier this year and updates it. It's a necessary step, really. They need to finalize the budget and the tax rates pretty soon to, get the tax notices out.
And the number that's really jumping out is that projected 7.8% property tax increase for 2025.
Yeah, that's the headline figure.
For a typical homeowner, what does that actually look like? We're talking about roughly $222 more per year, just for the city portion.
That's the estimate, yes. Or about $18.50 a month.
And then you add in the user fees.
Right. And when you factor those in, the total yearly increase is closer to $267, maybe $22.25 a month.
Okay, so what's the city's reasoning for this jump?
Well, the official line points to needing to invest, services, infrastructure. They mentioned Nanaimo being a city over 100,000 people now with assets worth over $4.8 billion. I think that figure was from a couple years back.
Right, growth requires investment.
But yeah, when you dig into where the specific spending increases are, that's where some questions about council's priorities start to bubble up for some people.
Absolutely. So looking at the details, there's more money for public space cleanliness. That starts September next year, is that right?
September 1, 2025, yeah.
And then there are these pretty chunky budget increases for specific projects, recommended by the Finance and Audit Committee, it seems.
That's right. You've got an extra $341,000 proposed for the Japanese-Canadian Memorial Garden,
Okay.
coming from the Strategic Infrastructure Reserve Fund, and another $400,000 from that same reserve for the Beeben Park outdoor performance and gathering space.
And these weren't in the first draft of the budget.
That's what's interesting. No, they came later. These were recommendations made by the Finance and Audit Committee. Looks like after they did some more review and got staff input. You can trace this back to their meeting agenda from April 16th.
So it kind of makes you wonder why these specific things became priorities later in the game, doesn't it?
It does raise that question, yeah. Process matters.
And it looks like the Finance and Audit Committee had another recommendation, too. Something about $20,000 for a festival bid.
Yes, a $20,000 commitment for 2026. This one's from the Special Initiatives Reserve. It's to support Nanaimo's bid to host the Pacific Contacts Showcase and Festival in 2026.
Okay, so that's clearly an investment in arts and culture, trying to attract an event.
Definitely signals that. The committee minutes would probably give more background on the why, who brought it forward, what the expected benefits are. The agenda shows the recommendation came from the Director of Parks, Recreation, and Culture.
Now, the financial plan document itself, it ties all this spending back to the city's big picture plan, right? The city plan, Nanaimo Reimagined.
It does. It lists those 5 main goals: a green Nanaimo, connected, healthy, empowered, and prosperous Nanaimo.
And it's under that Empowered Nanaimo goal, the one focusing on reconciliation, representation, and inclusion, that some of these initiatives fall. And this is where, for some people, the questions about let's say, ideological motivations come up.
Well, an empowered Nanaimo covers things like investing in arts and culture, which we just mentioned, but also ongoing funding for recognizing National Indigenous People Day and Truth and Reconciliation Day.
Right. Important goals for sure, but...
But some residents might ask, are these core municipal services in the traditional sense? Or is this taxpayer money being directed towards a specific social agenda?
Exactly. It really highlights how the same spending can be viewed very differently. One person sees vital steps towards inclusion, another sees, well, taxpayer funds maybe pushing a certain ideology. What's your take on how these allocations serve the broader community paying the taxes?
Well, what's important for you, the listener, to see is how the city frames it. The plan itself presents these as supporting those five big goals, which they say came out of public consultation.
So the document connects the spending directly to those pre-approved goals.
Yes, it doesn't judge the merit, it just makes the link. The Finance and Audit Committee agenda from April 16th, for instance, shows that Pacific Contact funding was presented by staff as a request framed as an opportunity.
Okay, so after the financial plan amendment bylaw gets sorted, then comes the Property Tax Rates Bylaw 2025, number 7397. These two are linked, obviously.
Absolutely essential link.
Hmm.
Once the spending plan, the financial plan, is set, this rates bylaw is the tool that actually figures out the tax rate per $1,000 of assessed property value.
That's how they collect the money they plan to spend.
Precisely. It generates the revenue needed.
Now, here's an interesting point that might get overlooked with all the talk about rising taxes.
Hmm.
The average assessed value for homes in Nanaimo actually went down slightly this year, like 0.04%.
Yeah, that's a really crucial detail. It means that even though the overall tax rate is going up by that 7.8%, the change in your specific tax bill depends entirely on what happened to your property's assessment compared to that tiny average decrease.
So if my assessment dropped more than 0.04%,
Your tax increase might actually be less than 7.8%, maybe significantly less.
but if my assessment dropped less or stayed flat or even went up,
Then you could be looking at a tax hike that's higher than that 7.8% average. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all impact. It's much more nuanced.
okay, good point. Let's shift gears a bit and look at the bigger economic picture. We have the 2025 State of the Economy Report. This should give us some context, right? Are these financial decisions happening in good times or
Sure.
more challenging ones?
Yeah, this report gives a pretty wide-angle view of Nanaimo's economy. Demographics, jobs, housing, all the key stuff. And understanding this backdrop is, well, it's essential for judging whether these financial choices are, responsible and sustainable long-term.
What are some of the key trends jumping out from that report? Demographics.
Okay, demographics. It highlights continued population growth, projecting about 1.7% annually. Also, a growing senior population, the 65-plus group, is getting bigger, and increasing ethnic diversity in the city.
And those shifts obviously have an impact on what the city needs to provide, right?
Yeah.
Services for seniors, infrastructure for more people.
Exactly. These are real-world factors the council should be considering when they're making these financial plans.
Okay, what about the housing market? The report mentioned a shift towards apartments, more rental demand.
Yes, and something quite striking. A big drop in the value of building permits issued in 2024, down 44%.
Wow, 44%.
Yeah. And housing starts, down even more. A 63% decline in 2024. That definitely points to a slowdown in construction activity.
That sounds pretty significant. Any reasons given?
The report suggests the usual suspects: higher interest rates, rising construction costs, general inflation playing a role. They seem hopeful that if interest rates ease off later this year, maybe things pick up a bit in 2025.
But a slowdown now could mean issues down the road,
Yeah.
like housing supply, affordability.
Absolutely. It could impact future availability and affordability, and potentially it could even affect the city's future tax base if development slows too much, which, makes you look even closer at the justification for spending increases right now.
Right. What about jobs, the labor force?
Labor force actually saw a slight contraction in 2024, which is interesting, but the unemployment rate stayed pretty stable, around 4.7%. That's actually lower than the BC average.
Okay, so relatively low unemployment. Where are the jobs concentrated?
Mostly in sales and service, trades, healthcare. The report notes Nanaimo has fewer jobs compared to the provincial average in sectors like professional services, STEM, finance, often higher paying fields.
And there was something about a replacement ratio.
Yeah, the labor force replacement ratio is 0.70. That basically means for every 10 people retiring or leaving the workforce, only 7 are entering, which indicates, more people are leaving than joining.
That sounds like a potential problem long term.
It could be a real challenge for the economy down the line, yeah. And that underrepresentation in those higher growth sectors, that could limit future opportunities too. The report itself kind of hints at needing to strengthen those areas.
Okay, income and spending. How are Nanaimo residents doing?
Well, the median household income has gone up over the last 5 years, which is good news. but
Hmm.
it's still lagging behind the BC average.
So better, but not keeping pace provincially.
Kind of. And while there's a growing number of higher income households, the report also suggests increasing affordability pressures for people on lower incomes. There's a widening gap, maybe.
What about the living wage?
The living wage for Nanaimo is cited as $23.79 an hour. The report notes this is actually the lowest on Vancouver Island.
Lowest. Why is that?
They attribute it mainly to relatively more affordable housing compared to places like Victoria, for example. But, and this is a key but, the report also points out that Nanaimo households spend a larger share of their income on shelter compared to the national average.
Wait, so even with a lower living wage benchmark, housing costs are taking a bigger bite out of people's budgets here.
That seems to be the implication. It really highlights the affordability crunch many folks are likely feeling, even if the living wage number looks lower than elsewhere on the island.
That growing income gap you mentioned, plus higher shelter costs. It raises questions about who benefits from the current economy and maybe who gets hit hardest by tax increases.
It certainly puts the tax increase into a different perspective, doesn't it? You have to consider the burden on different income groups.
And just quickly, tourism. Any bright spots there?
Yeah, tourism seems to be doing okay. The report mentioned higher hotel occupancy, short-term rentals doing well, and more delegate days at the conference center. So that sector looks like it's recovering.
Okay. And the Tourism Nanaimo quarterly update that council received would have more detail on that.
Presumably, yes. That was presented at the May 5th meeting. Their Q1 review apparently mentioned things like working with Sneenmux's First Nation and redesigning grant programs with an inclusion focus. So tying back into those broader city goals again.
Right. Okay, finally, let's look at the council meetings themselves. The Finance and Audit Committee on April 16th, that's where those funding recommendations for the Memorial Garden, the Bevan Park space, the Pacific Contact bid, that's where they originated.
Correct. Those recommendations were formulated there, then passed along to the full council for the meeting on May 5th.
And that May 5th regular council meeting agenda confirms they were dealing with the big financial bylaws.
Yes, absolutely. The agenda clearly lists the Financial Plan Amendment bylaw and the Property Tax Rates bylaw for first, second, and third readings. That shows council was moving forward with these decisions.
So basically pushing them through the required steps.
That's the legislative process, yeah. The agenda also confirms council received those presentations. We talked about the tourism update and the State of the Economy report from the Economic Development Officer.
Okay. One other thing I noticed in the Finance and Audit Committee agenda was a motion to close part of the meeting. Go in camera.
Yes, there was a motion for that. The reasons cited were related to ongoing negotiations and considering closing other meetings, which fall under the allowable exceptions in the community charter.
Allowed, yes. But it still makes you wonder, doesn't it? When decisions or discussions happen behind closed doors.
It's understandable why residents might raise questions about transparency. Even if it's legally permitted, the why isn't always clear from the outside. What exactly needed to be kept confidential?
Right. So let's try and connect the dots here for everyone listening. We've got a significant property tax hike on the table,
7.8% projected average.
driven by a financial plan that includes new or increased spending. Some of that spending is on specific projects, like the garden and the performance space, and initiatives like the festival bid, which fall under city goals related to arts, culture, reconciliation, inclusion.
Areas that, as we discussed, some might view through an ideological lens or question as core priorities, while others see them as essential investments.
And all this is happening against an economic backdrop that shows, well, a bit of a mixed bag. Population growth, yes, but also a slowing housing market, affordability pressures, and potential labor force challenges.
That sums it up pretty well. The economic report shows both strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and challenges. The council's financial choices, like funding those specific projects or backing the Pacific Contact bid, are concrete decisions about where taxpayer money goes. And yes, they're presented as supporting those empowered Nanaimo goals.
And it's precisely those kinds of initiatives, justified under those broad city goals, that seem to be fueling some of the concerns we hear about the council's priorities and maybe their agenda.
That seems to be the crux of the issue for some observers, yes.
So, for you listening, hopefully this gives you a clearer picture. Based directly on the city's own documents. You see the size of the tax increase, where some specific money is going, the economic context, and how council links these decisions to their stated goals.
And having this information really empowers you, doesn't it? It means you can ask much more specific, informed questions of the mayor and council about their priorities, about these financial commitments.
We definitely encourage you to keep an eye on future agendas, look at the financial reports as they come out.
Yeah, understand the reasoning they give for each decision. Does it make sense to you? How does it fit the city's long-term plan? And importantly, how does it impact you as a taxpayer?
So the final thought for you to take away from this deep dive is this. Considering these financial commitments, this spending, alongside Nanaimo's current economic situation, what specific questions are you going to ask your elected officials about the priorities and the future direction of this city?